ಪ್ರಸಾದ ಆಯ್ತು. ಓಕೆ, ಬಾಯ್. Good evening and welcome to tonight's live interaction. I'm really looking forward to tonight's live interaction because obviously early warning is a critical subject and a lot depends on it. Loss of lives can be saved with early warning infrastructure and scientific installations. Early warning is actually some kind of a scientific precept, so to say. It's based on scientific installations. And oh, how do I stop this thing? That video is playing. I need to stop that. Um, yeah, I hope it's working now. Yeah, early warning is based on a scientific precept where you have installations to warn, give an early warning about impending or prospective calamities. It could be for cyclones. It could be uh, a post calamity disaster like a tsunami following an earthquake, or it could be, so you have forecasting centers, or it could be an early warning of an imminent volcanic explosion. That kind of thing is early warning. And it's also based on a lot of signs from Mother Nature itself. Like, for example, a volcanic eruption is preceded by a lot of earthquake activity or earthquake swarm. That is that so that kind of precepts are there. The whole point of early warning as an institution is to make sure that there are standard operating procedures in place, which is also translated into public policy and legislation, so that people can take it. Could be the public administration that takes action based on the early warning recommendations. It could be something like, evacuation because of a impending cyclone, or if there is an earthquake forecasting is not yet possible, although it's at least not accepted in the scientific community as of now. So it could be, and it's not been very successful to make earlier, because it is considered still in the field of conjecture. It is not accepted. But you and that is why you're not able to take cognizance of earthquake forecasting and take shall we say cognitive action like evacuation, only because the scientific community has not accepted it. So that's one reason. And if it's in a volcanic eruption or a cyclone, we've not been able to forecast pandemics or anything in the public health so far, though there have been, shall we say, a lot of announcements by the WHO with regard to pandemics. It could be H1N1. These are past 3, 4 decades. We've seen a lot of this kind of mutating viruses: chikungunya, dengue, H1N1, H1N5, H1N9, and then there was the bird flu, the swine flu, and so on. There have been standard operating procedures prescribed by the WHO, but it is post, shall we say, announcement of the calamity. It's not been possible to forecast public health emergencies so far. Uh, So as of now, it is yeah, tsunami forecasting has reached a certain level of sophistication and success, cognitive success. But again, your Mother Nature has her secrets. The recent Tonga volcanic eruption, though there were some kind of volcanic eruptions over the 1 month before the mega eruption on 15th January or 13th January. Before that, there was a lot of indicative signs, so to say, uh, and but that was not taken seriously for whatever reason, or it was there was no uh, early warning issued, and therefore it follows that there was no standard operating procedure, did not translate into action, like evacuation, and then it boom it didn't, there was not so much of lava flow from the that particular volcanic eruption. It was more of a steam that uh, exploded, and it exploded so big and so mighty was the explosion that it went to the stratosphere, 55 or 59 kilometers up into the air. And that has created not just a sonic boom, the sonic boom reverberated around planet Earth 3 to 4 times. What will be the repercussions of that on the atmospheric sign? I mean, atmospheric elements. Could it be the stratosphere? It could be the layer beyond the stratosphere. There is a particular word for that. I don't know. So those things are. What will it have? What will the bearing? Its bearing be on, say, moisture, on humidity, on so many other dry aridity, etc. around planet Earth. We should see what is going to be, or if it's going to affect the monsoons. These are factors that we need to yet to see yet to see it. So, well, there are early warning, like for example, even if you have an early warning for a volcanic eruption, we are not able to, I don't think even the most advanced institutes like the USGS is able to forecast the volcanic explosivity index of a volcano. You can't, as of in today's advanced level of science and technology, it's not possible to forecast the the might of the volcanic explosivity index, and for example, and the impact of the volcano on so many factors. It could be trade winds, it could be monsoons, it could be so many things. It could be fisheries, it could be sea currents and tides, eddies, it could be shipping, it could be moisture content, or it could be just, yeah, I mean, the more humidity is so essential for the triggering of the monsoons, or the Indian Ocean dipole, and so on, or agriculture, sericulture, fisheries, international trade, public policy, and so on. It can have enormous repercussions on soil and soil conservation, agricultural output, food security, in various parts, in microclimate or in a particular hemisphere. So it can have a serious impact on the economy, so to say. But are we prepared? Do we have the wherewithal to prepare, to be ready for the impact of the volcano? We don't know. Even USGS is not able to say. USGS is considered the most advanced program, has the most advanced volcanism program, and the Smithsonian institutions, along with the global volcanism program of the Smithsonian institutions and the USGS together, they make some fantastic maybe references or recommendations and so on. But they were able to, for example, in 2018, they were able to say Kilovia's explosion is becoming more aggressive. There is a need for people to evacuate and such so on and so forth. The standard operating procedure kicked into place. Then the impact of the lava plume, or yeah, the ash plume, which goes around, spins around the world over a period of 18 months. What is the impact of that on planet Earth, on humanity, on agriculture, fisheries, sericulture, shipping, trade, public policy, economy? These are things that need to be calibrated by administrators, by research scholars, and so on. Uh, How does early warning installation help natural calamities? How does early warning installation help women, children, and mental people living with mental health issues when natural calamities occur? That's what he means. He has said it in Kannada, with in English font. So that's what he means. So let me tackle it one by one. Yes, to whether the gender perspective is extremely important. If you have a forecast for, say, the Kosi River floods or any river of sorrow, it could be in I think in China it is the Hongho is uh, the river of sorrow, which is very prone to floods. So, and women and children are very vulnerable to floods without access to water and sanitation. Children are really affected. Children and women are really affected. Women have separate needs, men have separate needs, and you can't afford to have a compromised water sanitation infrastructure. So early warning helps in evacuation, and a high human development index can help in proportionately preparing the human society or the human landscape. If you have the gender matrix of a particular community, then you can say, okay, there are so many women, there is a need for preparing women for to this extent. So maybe it could be menstrual cups or menstrual sanitary towels and water and sanitation, so many toilets exclusively for women, so many toilets exclusively for children. So that kind of planning is necessary and will help if there is an early warning institution. But early warning is helpful only to the extent that there is a follow-up action and institutional procedures, and also a perfect infrastructure for, I mean, it could be evacuation infrastructure for as a preventive measure, or it should all be in proportion to the human development index. So yes, if you have to include or calibrate a gender perspective into early warning, then you can actually plan. But that calls for extremely high economic resilience and economic development. Now the early warning systems of 40 seconds ಮೊದಲು ಅಷ್ಟೇ warning ಕೊಡೋದು, ಇದಕ್ಕಿಂತ ಬೇರೆ solution ಇಲ್ಲ. See, for earthquake forecasting, I presume that is what you're talking about. Earthquake forecasting is still not in the realm of scientific. It is not in the realm of scientific discussion. It's not been taken cognizance of. There are alternative means of earthquake forecasting, like I believe in the lunar cycle, for example. If you go by the lunar cycle, and if the 11th or the 26th happen to be either the new moon or the full moon, you can expect with reasonable surety that there is going to be an earthquake. And if you follow the earthquake patterns in the public domain, with the information in the public domain, then you can easily see that the earthquakes, like for instance, in the past 1 week, there have been a few earthquakes in the mid-Atlantic ridge in the Atlantic Ocean. This is a place, though the mid-Atlantic ridge goes through the Atlantic Ocean, we've not seen much of earthquake or seismic activity there for a long time, at least not powerful earthquakes. Yes, minor earthquakes are being detected in the past 1 week, according to the USGS. But yes, I mean, if there is an increase in earthquake activity, then it portends something, right? That is what we need to calibrate, study, observe, and document. So that is when you will be able to assess or come to a pattern saying this is what you can expect. But a 40-second earthquake early warning is more or less futile. I mean, this I have mentioned it in this chapter. Indeed, the Indian Seismological Institute of Seismological Research in Gujarat, in India, was set up, I think, after the Gujarat earthquake of 2001. There is a lot of competitive firing of questions. I'm so happy to see this. Anyway, the earthquake after the Gujarat earthquake of 2001, I think the Indian Seismological Institute has been set up, and they have trying very hard, and most scientific establishments are trying very hard to uh, arrive at some kind of a earthquake early warning, shall we say, established protocol or whatever. So they have come up, the ISR in Gujarat has come up with a model with 30 to 40 seconds of early warning, where they say in case an earthquake occurs in, say, the extreme western part of Gujarat, that is in near Rajkot or Kutch or Bhuj, which was the epicenter of the 2001 January earthquake. So, in case there is an earthquake there that happens, and it's an extremely volatile area, seismically volatile area in the Makaran range. So, if in case a big earthquake of more than 6 or 7 happens there, then by the time the tremors touch or reach eastern Gujarat, which is the so-called hinterland, and you have the capital Ahmedabad or the bigger cities like Baroda. So before the earthquake tremors reach this portion of eastern, let me show this to you on Google Earth. I think that helps. Can you see this? Okay. Let me show this with Google Earth. Huh? So this is Gujarat for you. If the earthquake happens in this border town, border areas, or the far end of Gujarat, which is actually extremely volatile, seismically volatile, by the time if this is the epicenter, or even if the epicenter is somewhere in southern Pakistan, by the time the tremors and the impact of the tremors reach, say, Ahmedabad or Vadodara, the point of this 40-second early warning for the earthquake is that 40 seconds is enough for evacuation, but 40 seconds is barely enough for evacuation of a multi-story building. Earthquake prone ಏರಿಯಾದಲ್ಲಿ ಬಹು ಅಂತಸ್ತಿನ ಕಟ್ಟಡ ಕಟ್ಟಬಾರದು ಇಂತಹ ರೂಲ್ಸ್ ಹಾಲನ್ ಮಾಡುವುದು ಒಳ್ಳೆಯದೇ. Yes, he's asking, isn't it a good practice to make sure that policy ensures that multi-storied buildings are not built in earthquake-prone areas? That is common sense. It's not rocket science. We should, in earthquake-prone areas, you should never build multi-storied buildings, and any violation of setbacks or any violation of any kind of law, construction law or construction code, is a recipe for disaster. So you should not. For example, in Ahmedabad and Vadodara or Baroda, I have seen a lot of high-rise buildings, which is considered prosperity. It is so ridiculous. For the likes of us journalists, high-rise buildings only is a manifestation of vertical economic growth, not horizontal inclusive economic growth. It's quite literally the case. In any case, high-rise buildings are not stable, especially in an earthquake-prone area, and it is absolutely stupid, I'm sorry to say, to build high-rise buildings in earthquake-prone areas. And then because of the complications of this kind of vertical growth of construction, setbacks are violated and there are no spaces in between two buildings. So even in case of a fire, never mind the earthquake, even in case of a fire, the fire engine cannot go in there to douse a fire. So any compromise with the law is a recipe for disaster. And yes, a 40-second early warning is definitely not enough for people to evacuate a high-rise building in an earthquake-prone zone or otherwise. In fact, after the Bhuj earthquake, activists and they realized that there is a need for something called earthquake safe architecture, because they learned that all the one-storied mud buildings and mud houses in western Gujarat, in Bhuj area or Kutch area, they all survived the earthquake. Only these cement concrete structures, they were the ones which crashed, and they were the ones which really had a debilitating impact on humanity. But in Bhuj and all, you have this, one rammed earth constructions or, one-story tenements, which did not have an impact, and they stood firm. They stood. So then the concept of earthquake resilient or earthquake safe architecture came about as a concept in disaster risk reduction. So yeah, that's why, and even now they're there. So that so if you go by traditional architecture, which is agro-meteorological and conforming to agrometeorology, then obviously it is safer. But the concept of earthquake safe architecture is now being propounded by the likes of scientists and researchers from, say, Indian Institute of Science, Indian Institute of Technology, Kanpur, or IIT Guwahati. They are doing some enormous amount of work in the fields of earthquake safe architecture. There is something else after the Mexico earthquake of 1985. They also came about with some kind of a where was I? They came about with some kind. This video is playing. I don't know how to stop the video. Okay, I hope that works. Uh, yeah, so they came about with some kind of a earthquake safe architecture which has, bars right across the building in a horizontal, in a diagonal way, which allows the building to waver this way a bit and still stay safe. It's pillared construction with a lot of steel and a lot of iron bars, which allows the building to sway a bit but stands firm. It does not collapse. There is that kind of, it is some kind of steel rubber bands or whatever are put across the building to hold it. Oh, multi-story. Even in Burj Khalifa in Dubai, etc., they have these huge structures which have to be safe from hydrometeorological calamities coming from the Gulf. So these kind of new wave, new age architectural evolutionary precepts are happening. Uh, it's a work in progress. That's all I can say. Then I should see. Oh wow, there are so many questions. Um, can you have early warning for public health issue? I think I just mentioned this. In as far as the WHO does issue warnings as soon as there is a public health issue, like when recently in 2019 October when COVID started making its presence felt in Wuhan, WHO was already alert, and but it had not become a pandemic as yet. They were watching very seriously, and you can give a public health warning, or it's difficult to do public health forecasting, as in, I mean, if you expect a virus or if you expect a seasonal disease, yes, perhaps it is possible. Yes, perhaps it is possible. But still, again, I must say it is a work in progress. It calls for a hell of a lot of infrastructural support, which humanity is yet to develop. We have, for example, we have spent a lot of money on tsunami forecasting after the Asian tsunami. So we have come to a fair level of sophistication and success with tsunami forecasting. But then again, the Tonga volcanic eruption had triggered a specific wide tsunami, which in this day and age took a toll of 3 human lives. Anyway, so nature is always one step ahead of us, I would say. Public health, no, we don't yet have an early warning system as in place as yet. What is the next question? What are the early warnings for volcanic eruptions? What are the scientific installations that humanity relies on to forecast volcanic eruptions? To my knowledge, volcanic eruptions are forecast based on the earthquake swarm that is triggered by the imminence of a volcanic eruption. Like if there is a volcano that is about to erupt very soon, there is an there is a swarm of earthquakes that happen there in the vicinity of the volcanic crater or the volcanic mount or whatever. So there are lot of earthquake activity there. That is enough for the scientific institutions. Usually it's like the Volcanological Survey of Indonesia, for instance, or the PHIVOICS in Philippines, or USGS, etc. They issue early warning saying this volcano is likely to erupt very soon. They can't yet forecast the volcanic explosivity index, mind you, but they can talk of there is an imminence of there is a volcanic eruption that's likely to happen imminently. So that kind of a forecast they can make. And in fact, there are monitors, like in some volcanoes, they have placed these kind of I don't know what meters they're called. It's not seismographs actually, like in earthquakes. There is some kind of a machinery or a scientific installation they do, which puts them there, and they have a system in place. So they will issue, say, if Mount Krakatau, and Krakatau is about to is has increased its activity in the last fortnight or so. What they say is it's on orange alert. So they say, please, visitors don't go there. That kind of system is in place. In Hawaii too, it's in place. In Philippines too, it's in place. Indonesia, large parts of Indonesia are volcanic. In fact, there are, I think, 167 or 137 active volcanoes in Indonesia. So they are the Volcanological Survey of Indonesia does this. They monitor, and they have these scientific installations or meters to gauge how much of volcanic activity is imminent, and they put a corresponding alert is sounded. Uh, but for coming back to earthquake, even if you have a earthquake that has happened and a tsunami has been forecast, you need a whole list of, or a whole bandwidth of standard operating procedures in place. You have to broadcast it on the public radio, on public television, then you have to put it up on social media, the forecast, I mean, and then you have to sound the sirens, and you've got to broadcast it on ham radio, loudspeakers. So for that, you need to have all these installations in place. Loudspeakers should be functional. Then just before or just immediately after the tsunami arrives, the power has to be switched off to prevent electricity failures or short circuiting or whatever. But what happens invariably, and it happened in Nicobar in 2012, the power was switched off before the tsunami came and hit the land. So that is a blatant faux pas. It is a mistake, and that is it can cause a lot of damage and loss of lives. If power is an essential supply, if you compromise on that, but it is again a very difficult line to thread, so to say. If there is a difference, if you have to, the power supply should be automated and switched off within seconds after the tsunami arrives. That kind of automation is necessary. And you also have to have early warning, has to be broadcast not just on a public radio and public media or whatever. It should also be a subscription based SMS service, for example. So these kind of things are necessary to have an early warning in place. Let's go to the next question. Are there scientific installations to prevent and quantify the impact of volcanic eruptions? Quantify the impact of volcanic eruptions. I think that is the operative word here. Are there any scientific installations? You can't prevent volcanic eruption, no. To quantify the impact of volcanic eruption, that is again no. That is they're falling short. The impact of volcanic eruption can be on agriculture, atmospheric sciences, water output, moisture stress, humidity, aridity, and then agriculture, fisheries, and aviation, public policy, shipping, trade. When shipping is involved, obviously it has an impact on trade, so on and so forth. As we know, in the past 1 week, the war that has started in Ukraine is going to have an impact on, the first impact is going to be on the price of fuel. Like that, when shipping is involved, the immediate impact is on trade and fuel prices. And once fuel prices are affected, the whole economic chain is affected, so to say. So that is how you need, and that has to be calibrated on a case by case basis to evolve best practices to understand the impact, and then you can evolve best practices and help define policy. uh, to quantify the impact of volcanic eruption, again, let's come back. Let's take agriculture, for instance. After the Krakatau volcanic eruption in 1883, the ashfall fell also in Bengal, undivided Bengal those days. In the near term, it was devastation. The soil, the crop failed, and things like that. And there was a water stress, the monsoons failed, etc. But in the near term, it started regaining its fertility, and after 10 years, it seems the fertility of agricultural produce in that area. Let me show you that area again. I think I should show you here. Go back here. Krakatau exploded here in between Java and Sumatra. That was a supervolcanic explosion in 1883. This area. Now it's gone. You can see this. There's no land right now. This is the one. This is Krakatau. So that exploded in a supervolcanic eruption in 1883, August 27th, 1883, and it affected the entire region here in South and Southeast Asia. Uh, Apparently, what I'm talking of agricultural production in undivided Bengal, so this area was apparently affected by the ashfall. In the near term, crops failed, but in the mid-term, the crops improved, and there was a lot of agricultural output. Then in in the long term, again, it becomes very fertile. In fact, biodiversity recovers over a period of say 10, 20 years or 30 years. And then it also affects the monsoons, especially in the Indian Ocean rim countries. It affects the monsoons. uh, that's another question. What do you mean? Yeah, it can have an positive impact. In fact, in the 2000, no, sorry, 1815, the Tambora in, I'll tell you where is Tambora again. Tambora is a supervolcanic eruption. I think this is Tambora. Somewhere here is Tambora. Tambora is somewhere here. I should search for it. Yes. Here's Mount Tambora. This eruption, Mount Tambora's eruption, triggered something called a year without summer. Almost 8 years after, it lasted a whole decade, the impact of the Mount Tambora supervolcanic eruption. So that kind of impact is there. Usually a volcanic eruption takes about, for its full impact to be felt, takes around 18 months because the ash fall has to go around the earth. But then the Tambora eruption was so huge, it was a supervolcanic eruption, that it triggered agricultural failures and it triggered a year without summer in somewhere as far away as Canada. Now, here's right across the Pacific. Here in this part of eastern Canada, it triggered the lapse of a summer. So, without summer, the crops fail and it led to huge hunger and famine and so on. Now, again, the Tonga volcanic eruption, though we do have a lot of resilience in terms of food security, how it is going to affect food crop production, etc., is something that remains to be noted, researched, documented, etc. Now, coming back to the next question. So it's not, and then that's agriculture. Then what about aviation? Aviation, of course, its immediate impact is on aviation. All flights have to stop. We've seen that in the past 10, 12 years when in 2010, when the volcano called Bardar Banga erupted in Iceland, it halted aviation in Europe. In fact, my own parents got stuck in Barcelona airport. Then my father ran out of medicines. They were stuck because the flights were cancelled. And I was panicking. How do you get them across on alternate routes? They were on a tourist visa and we have to get them across. So they're not just my parents, but there were passengers who were stranded. Transatlantic trade stopped. Europe was, which is dependent on a lot of imports from a lot of places, was facing the prospect of some kind of food security problems. Then, like I said, passengers stuck in Barcelona airport and many airports, they found that they were running out of medicines. And then in 2014, there was a very interesting observation, I think, by the University of Leeds. The volcanic emissions from, not Bardar Banga, this was, I think, Bardar Banga in 2014, the Bardar Banga. In 2010, sorry, did I mention Bardar Banga? No, it was Eyjafjalla Jökull. In 2014, Bardar Banga exploded in Iceland, and the University of Leeds made a measure of the sulfur emissions from the volcano. It apparently neutralized the carbon emissions from industrial Europe of one day. Such is the, it just needs research and documentation. So then you had, the sulfur emissions from a volcanic explosion can create near-term climate change. It can lead to near-term cooling. That was the case with Pinatubo in Philippines also in 1991. It was such a huge volcanic explosion of more than VEI 5. That's volcanic explosivity index 5 or 6, I think. It created near-term climate change. It cooled the planet by about 1.5 degrees over a period of 2 years. So that was possible. So that then aviation, like the Eyjafjallajökull halted aviation across Europe, and that can have obviously an impact on medicines, imports, trade, etc., food security, and so on. Uh, Europe has to import rice from Asia. If a volcanic eruption prevents aviation or shipping, then they're staring at food security. Are there enough standard operating procedures to prepare for multi-sectoral preparation for the impact of volcanic eruption? That's what we were talking about. In case of a volcanic eruption, it can have an impact on agriculture, aviation, public health, and weather systems, and can have an impact on the landscape conservation. Like it can create mudslides and lahar flows that can ruin the landscape. So again, food security is a problem. It can create flash floods in the nearby area. It can trigger tsunamis if it's a coastal area. Then it so if there, and each one of them will have a debilitating impact on the human landscape. If there are flash floods, I mean, there is no way you can prevent a flash flood. If there are lahar floors, you can't prevent it. But then what is the aftermath, the repair and reconstruction? So for the repair and reconstruction, like that is one of the multi-sectoral thing. You have to have low-cost construction technologies which can be resilient to natural calamities, which can be climate neutral. So these kind of architectural precepts have to be taken cognizance of. It needs to be documented. Architecture has to go through a revolution to be prepared for climate change or for any kind of natural calamity. In the day and age of climate change happening, yes, it's necessary for architecture to adapt to climate change precepts. You don't have to have cement concrete structures. You don't have to have multi-story structures which are utterly unsustainable and unsafe. Instead, if you have low cost construction, you can make it with alternate earthen material. Bamboo is the new steel. Then you can have it with so many other earthen material. It could be lateritic rock, it could be sand, it could be rammed earth, and you need a lot of ventilation to prevent in COVID like situations. So that kind of thing, yeah, right. And then what else do we have to have? Yeah, public health is an issue. If the volcanic eruption is powerful enough and it straddles the stratosphere with sulfur emissions, and it blocks the sun rays to howsoever an extent, it can trigger that much. To that extent, it can create a volcanic winter. When it creates a volcanic winter, again, the impact of it is on agriculture, architecture, aviation, and then you have weather systems, epidemics or pandemics, public health, and then you have food security, you have floods, flash floods, famines, then you have fugue or fog, and can trigger El Nino in the Pacific Ocean. Usually Pacific Ocean, El Nino is triggered usually by volcanic activity in the South Pacific Ocean. And what does it have? In 2015, the Godzilla El Nino, it reversed not just the currents in the southern Pacific Ocean, it reversed the currents and the magmatic flow in the North Pacific Ocean, according to some NOAA reports that I had read. If it becomes anti-clockwise, even in the northern hemisphere or the North Pacific, the impact of it is phenomenal in terms of local weather systems, a microclimate, and so on. So it is impossibly complex. And to calibrate each one of them calls for a huge study. It's not easy to do that. It sounds very interesting, at least to me. And I'm so glad you asked me this question. So standard operating procedure, till we document each multi-sectoral, the impact of any calamity on different sectors, till we document it in public domain and research and calibrate and confabulate and then arrive at a public policy, then it should be translated into policy or public policy or legislation. That is when we have standard operating procedures. Till then, it is all It's sensational media reportage. It is, but it needs a solid engagement. That's what I mean. It needs sustained engagement. It has an impact on fisheries, on ocean tides, on trade winds. Then it can have an impact on agriculture, aviation, architecture, in fact, and it can have microclimate. There will be near term and long term climate change, or the impact at least is felt in the near term and the long term. Then there is, what else is there? It can lead to drought and desertification in one area, flooding and flash flooding in another, in the opposite place. Uh, you can calibrate it latitude, longitude wise. You can calibrate it. Uh, so then that's how. So it can have an impact on human consumption patterns in the human landscape. It can have an impact, obviously, on the economy of the whole human landscape. Uh, then it can impact on public policy, trade, and so on. There's an infinite scope for research and sustained engagement so that we can bring out the best policies. But it's a very interesting question, Mr. McAllister. What will be the impact of the volcanic eruption in the Pacific island state of Tonga on monsoons in the Indian Ocean rim countries? What will that remains to be seen. See, it was an unexpected and unforecast volcanic eruption. At least its magnitude was not forecast. There was not so much of lava plume that went in. It was more of steam burst, and it when the steam explosion happened, it broke the sound barrier, and because of that, it reverberated. I think twice this side, and it came back. Then this side it went once and came back. So altogether, four times it reverberated around the planet. Now that will have an impact definitely on atmospheric sciences. I mean, elements of the atmosphere, stratosphere, atmosphere, etc. And it can have an impact on the bearing of moisture, on trade winds, on the Indian Ocean dipole. It's a very, very serious uh, thing. The Indian Ocean dipole is a very serious scientific, shall we say, phenomenon. Yeah, it is. What is clockwise in the northern hemisphere becomes anti-clockwise motions in the southern hemisphere, and the clouds turn around in if they turn around in the opposite direction as against the normal, it can create havoc. Or even if it strengthens or augments the monsoon-bearing clouds or the moisture winds or whatever, so it can create. I don't know how do I come back to this. I don't know where I am. This is very confusing. Right. So it can have an impact on so many phenomena. What will be the impact of a volcanic eruption in the Pacific island state of Tonga on monsoons in the Indian Ocean rim countries? The monsoon is most critical and relevant to the Indian Ocean rim countries because, in fact, monsoons are referred to as monsoons only in the Indian Ocean. Other places it's considered rain or storm or hurricane, typhoon, etc. In the Indian Ocean rim countries, yes, they are dependent on monsoons. Because its cycle of life revolves around monsoons. It could be agriculture, it could be fisheries, it could be all aspects of life, food security, and because we depend on the monsoons for all aspects of our life. Mm. The crop failure can ruin our food security. Then if it's an El Nino has been triggered, I remember when 1987 El Nino, uh, it wrought havoc on Kenya, Ethiopia, and places like that. There was a 4-year drought, and if this, it's not an economically resilient country. Poor Ethiopia had so much destruction. There was so much of starvation, so much of starvation-related deaths in Ethiopia in 1980s, 84 to I think 83 to 87, 4 year. It was a debilitating El Nino that time. Yeah, and yeah, it could trigger that kind of starvation. Um, and in Indian Ocean rim countries are by and large, most of them are developing countries or emerging economies. They do not have resilience in terms of except for a few countries like, say, India, Thailand, uh, maybe to large extent Indonesia, Reunion Island, the Middle Eastern countries. They all have food security, but then Malaysia and so on, Australia, Western Australia, they all have food security. But there are countries like Madagascar. I'll show you again on Google Earth. Indian Ocean rim means this is the Indian Ocean. So these countries around the Indian Ocean, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Burma or Myanmar, Bangladesh, India, Sri Lanka, then you have Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, you have Muscat, Oman, Yemen, and then you have Saudi Arabia, you have Iran, then you have all the Somalia, and surprising, though, for example, this is this country. This is Ethiopia, right? Yeah, this is Ethiopia. Whereas Somalia is the coastal country. Ethiopia is actually in the hinterland, in inland. It is not touching the coast at all. But Ethiopia suffered so much after when the 1983 to 87 earthquake, El Nino happened. Then you have Seychelles, which is a very developed country. You have Reunion Island, which belongs to France. So that's also a very developed part of the Indian Ocean rim. You have Tanzania, you have Kenya, and then this is Somalia. These are all countries which are lacking in, shall we say, food security or the kind of resilience, economic, fiscal resilience that you would have in, say, New Zealand or Japan. Japan is not, for example, affected by El Nino, or they may be, but not as much as Indian Ocean rim countries. So these countries, yeah, the monsoons are affected, the moisture is affected, and without monsoons, agriculture is affected, shipping, uh, aviation, food security, all these are affected. Agricultural output, the entire economy, Indian economy, if when there is an El Nino, uh, the entire country shivers with fear, not with out of cold. I mean, we have unseasonal weather. That is the biggest problem. When there is unseasonal weather, it creates havoc on the entire economy. Then what, please give us a gender perspective of volcanic eruptions. Now, that's a wonderful question. Well, if you have an early warning for an volcanic eruption, then obviously you can evacuate the population living in the downstream of the ashfall, for example. So you can, if you evacuate, and if you have the infrastructure proportionate to the gender population, then you can create gender sensitive cabins. You can create rooms for maternity, maternal, for what do you say, breastfeeding stations for nursing mothers. You can have sanitary towel dispensers. You can have separate toilets for women and children and separate toilets for men. So these kind of preparations will help. But if it happens like in Tonga recently, it was unexpected, and it was not ash plume. It was steam that exploded in this mega explosion. It's supposed to be the biggest explosion, and it, like I said, it breached the sound barrier. But then coming back to the gender perspective again, in an economically less resilient country, human lives are human lives. There is no big separation for uh, gender sensitivity. Not just gender sensitivity. I think there was an earlier question about people living with mental health issues. To prepare people living with mental health issues to cope with the output, with the fallout of volcanic eruptions, is an enormous task. People who have mental health issues, it could be bipolar, it could be schizophrenia, Alzheimer's, dementia, or manic depressive psychosis, or somebody who's suffering from any kind of mental health issue. How do you train and calibrate and prepare them or factor them and get them to face the reality of a volcanic eruption? Isn't it hard? There are no ready answers as yet. So for people with frail and infirm, you need to have evacuation infrastructure which are compatible to the frail and infirm, to physically challenged people, to the elderly. And I mean, some there are, like, sometimes in geriatric care needs to be included in preparation. For example, if you have people who are well past 90 and you have to evacuate them before an imminent volcanic eruption, they're likely to say, "Oh, it's okay if I die here. I'm not going to leave this place. This place is mine, etc. This is my ancestral home." This is something that is constantly faced by the administrators. They say, oh my God, they ask people. I mean, people are attached to their inheritance or to their ancestral homes or whatever. They're not willing to evacuate. So these things, and this needs a lot of, media outreach for them to be prepared. And this has to be done in a very sensitive way, in a linguistically appropriate way, so that they understand the nuances. Say if it's a geriatric population of, or yeah, I mean, if there are people who are suffering from strokes or whatever, some age-related ailments, how do you prepare them to evacuate? And for them, it is as it is for them to go to the toilet and come back independently is hard. To get them to evacuate to a shelter and for them to stay there. Imagine, I mean, I know a particular person who has suffered a stroke and he is paralyzed. He's also lost his speech, poor man. For him to go to the toilet and come back takes 40 minutes, because he's got a difficulty. Now, if you have to evacuate him in preparation for a volcanic eruption, okay, he might listen. He might be so vulnerable. He might say, okay, I'm dependent on you. If you say I have to evacuate because there is a volcanic eruption, okay, let's do that. But then you have to give him a bed, him and his caregiver, a bed quite close to the toilet. You need to give them access to a toilet, the bathroom, water and sanitation, food security. He may be having diet restrictions. So imagine doing all this. Imagine having to create this kind of infrastructure and resilience for people with this kind of disabilities. It is such a humongous task. It is such a huge responsibility. And it all falls on the state. The buck stops at the office of the prime minister or the president, the head of state or the head of government. So there is a need for participatory or a democratized, decentralized decision making process, if you can call it that. And that is why it is so important to have youth task force in every community. I hope that I have answered your question to some extent at least. Please give us a gender perspective of volcanic eruptions is done. What is the impact of volcanic eruptions on international trade and politics? Yeah, I mean, if, for example, I took the Eyjafjallajökull volcanic eruption in 2010 in Iceland. It was so huge that it within hours, all aviation stopped. And when aviation stops, supplies stop, imports and exports stop. And for a country like, I mean, for Europe as a continent, or even Canada, which is dependent on imports of rice, for example, they need rice to be brought all the way from South and Southeast Asia. Uh, unless they have a corpus of food security, and even then, I mean, yeah, these are things which can degenerate, which can you can't have, it's perishable goods, so to say. You can't have fruits. You need to have refrigeration facilities for fruits and other perishable goods, commodities like fish. You might not get the kind of food that you want, even if there are diet restrictions on medical grounds. In a evacuation center, it's not easily feasible to cater to the dietary restrictions of evacuees. These are the hardships. And then how it impacts on trade is, yeah, if then it'll increase the price of food. Obviously, food security is something that is non-negotiable, right? And if there is not enough, it's a matter of then trade is dependent on two factors: demand and supply. Because of this kind of a calamity or a natural, yeah, and because of a natural calamity, if imports of food is affected, then the price of food will increase. Then the government has to step in and buffer in or subsidize food uh, sale or food distribution. If you It has to be done on non-economic terms, only in terms of logistics, the impact of it on the economy is enormous. I mean, you might not have, like it happened after the Asian tsunami, there was not enough logistical support to supply. There was a lot of aid coming in, but supply logistics failed. Even during the COVID pandemic, in India, supply chain was affected. So, and the migrant crisis were triggered by the lockdown. There was food security problems, livelihood security problems, and supply chain was affected. So these things happen. Uh, and that can affect once that, yeah, that is how it can affect uh, demand and supply, pricing, and then that is why you when pricing can happen. So the lesson learned from this pricing problem or this calamity can affect future policy, and that can affect international trade, international law. Then can if you if it has to it needs amendments on the WTO and so on. So that can affect the whole gamut of issues. You can see that. These are very interesting questions. Very nice. Thank you so much for asking. I hope it will help us uh, arrive at certain decisions or conclusions to help public evolution of public policy. Now, I've been online for 55 minutes now. I think that's good enough for today. It was a very interesting discussion. Thank you so much. I'm past as usual. The next week's video, I'm going to put it up by Friday night or Saturday. It will be about bioshields for disaster mitigation. Next Saturday, there might not be a live interaction because there are 3 chapters left, and at the end of every chapter, we will have a live interaction. Not every Saturday. It's going to be a slight change because I have to finish this fast uh, before 31st of March. So anyway, thanks a lot, Mr. McAllister and Mr. Guru Prasad, for your very vivacious questions. It was very nice, very interesting in discussion. Thank you so much for participating. Uh, let's till we meet again. Take care, keep smiling, stay home, stay safe. Ciao.